Me presento, yo soy Jacobo Celada, soy socio de Apple Tree Communications y para nosotros es un placer teneros a todos aquí. A los que no conozcáis nuestros Apple Tree Bytes, son sesiones que organizamos cada 2-3 meses sobre diferentes temáticas alrededor del apasionante mundo de la comunicación, y la verdad es que hoy tenemos mucha suerte porque tenemos un lujo de sesión, y si me disculpáis por deferencia y respeto a nuestro ponente, voy a seguir hablando en inglés. Let me introduce our extremely privileged guest. We're very, very, very honored and lucky to have Jamie Angus. Jamie is director of the World BBC Service. He oversees a small organization that communicates with 400 million people in the world every week through TV, radio, online. And he is with us today because he's been taking part in a conference that has been developing for the past 2 days in Madrid. As you can see on the roll-up here on my right side, this session today is co-organized with Club de Madrid. For those of you that don't know Club de Madrid, it's the biggest democratic organization of ex-presidents. It's really a fantastic organization, and the past 2 days they were organizing the 2019 policy dialogue, and these dialogues aim to bring people together and recommend ways forward to improve no less than the world. Their objective is to solve the world's problems, and this year the topic was digital transformation and the influence of artificial intelligence in democracies. So how technology and the internet, and specifically AI, can influence elections, public services, governments, and what we can all do, civil society, governments, entities, private organizations, to make sure that technology is used to improve democracy, to guarantee public service. In this context, the BBC obviously plays a huge role, and we all know what's been happening in the past few years with disinformation, digital campaigns, Cambridge Analytica, programmatic campaigns being led from God knows where. And I think that today's topic, for anyone who works in communication, is especially relevant, and we're very happy to have somebody of Jamie's experience and specifically his responsibilities within the BBC to talk to us about what the BBC is doing to ensure that information stays balanced and serves public service and not hidden or obscure agendas. So please welcome Jamie Angus from the BBC.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to see you. So thank you first to Apple Tree for hosting me this evening. It's delighted to accept this invitation. And also to the Club de Madrid, whose exceptionally interesting conference I've just been attending, and it's been a very, very worthwhile gathering. I had 2 hours off this afternoon, so I went to the Prado Museum, because I've never been before, and I spent a number of minutes sitting in front of a beautiful painting of the crucifixion of Christ, which reminded me of the ordeal of journalists covering Brexit in the UK. So I feel I've prepared myself spiritually to return to London and do battle with the unfolding chaos that's been going on for a number of years. So I'm sure we can come on to talk about that a little later in the presentation. So you've asked me to talk about disinformation and digital transformation. I'm delighted to do that because it's my pet subject and I can bore about it for years. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of the BBC in this context. Obviously the BBC has been around for almost 100 years. It's our centenary year in 2022. And it's paid for by the wonderful mechanism of the licence fee, which means that every household in Britain pays £150 a year towards the funding of the BBC. But in addition to that, the UK government also pays some money, pays £85 million a year for parts of the World Service, particularly our language services, because we broadcast in, or we provide news in 42 different languages, including English. So we're a very multilingual organisation, and as we'll see, a lot of that reach comes from languages other than English, including Spanish. Of course, BBC Mundo, our digital Spanish service, primarily for audiences in Latin America, but also used by some people here in Spain. So let's just, sorry, I skipped over that. Let's just talk a little bit about the size of the BBC's audience and why we do what we do. So the audience has jumped up very significantly in the last year. We're now reaching 426 million people weekly. It's a very big number. It's so big it's almost meaningless, but it's important that the direction of travel is going upwards. And a lot of that growth has come from new digital services in languages other than English. So the UK government has invested more money in the World Service in recent years. That £85 million of annual spend from the UK government has opened 12 new language services. So 3 regional languages in India, another 3 regional languages for Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, 4 regional languages in India, Korean for North Korea, and Serbian. I've probably forgotten 1 or 2. So we've got new language services that are driving a great deal of audience growth. And it's worth just pausing for a moment to say kind of why are we doing this? It's important that the independence of the BBC that's one of the most important things to BBC journalists, that we are genuinely independent. We're independent both from the UK government, which does pay some money for the BBC World Service, and we operate on behalf of everyone in the UK. I like to say that the BBC belongs to every person in the UK, and the soft power benefit of the BBC reaching an audience of this size means that UK audiences, when they travel abroad, are well treated. I often say that if you're a UK citizen and you travel abroad, you get a good reception because of the royal family, the Premier League, and the BBC World Service, and the 3 huge global institutions that drive perceptions of UK soft power outside the UK. But it does mean that we're sometimes attacked by being a kind of state broadcaster, so our critics in Russia, in Iran, in parts of the Middle East and elsewhere, sometimes in India, as we'll see, say that the BBC is not balanced and impartial, that it is the voice of the UK government. And of course that's untrue. We have had several very high-profile rows with the UK government over the years about the BBC's coverage of specific stories. So for all kinds of reasons, I'm very confident being able to point to our editorial operational independence from the government in the UK. So let's talk a little bit about our focus on fake news and disinformation. I became the director of the World Service Group about 18 months ago, and I was very clear then that I wanted to make this a big priority for the World Service, because I think that the fake news phenomenon is not going away, and in any kind of hurry. It's going to be something that will be with us for 10 years, 20 years to come. And the reason for that is that the transformation in the news industry caused by these is here to stay, and the proliferation of digital news and the collapse of well-respected commercial journalism organisations has created a great crisis in the digital space. And I think the BBC World Service, we have the sort of durability and the scale and the size to call out patterns of fake news where we see them and find interesting trends, some of which I'm going to talk to you about tonight, but also be a trusted source of analysis and information about fake news. So we've done quite a lot of work under the title Beyond Fake News in the last year. I'm going to tell you briefly a bit about that. I should just say that even using the term fake news has been controversial. Any of you who've worked in a newsroom won't be surprised to hear that we spent quite a long time arguing with our own journalists about whether we would even use the words fake news, because they are politically loaded and make a lot of journalists feel uncomfortable. But in the end, I said that we were going to, because audiences around the world understand what fake news is, even though it's a challenging title. So last year we commissioned a lot of original audience research, particularly in India and East and West Africa, to look at why audiences, particularly young digital audiences, share fake news. And we found some very interesting things. Just pick out really a few of them. We found that audiences generally overestimate their ability to spot fake news. So they often say, well, I'd be able to tell if it was fake or not, but they accept, in fact, that they can't. We also saw very interesting behaviours, particularly in Asian countries, South Asian countries, where audiences have very wide social network groups, often a family, kind of extended family group, and they will often share information, particularly through WhatsApp, to like 50, 70, 100 people at once. And this provides a really powerful vector for the sharing of poor quality news. And I'm particularly interested in WhatsApp, and I feel even more strongly after the Club de Madrid conference that we spend too much time talking about Twitter in particular, and to an extent Facebook, and not enough time talking about WhatsApp. So I think WhatsApp specifically, but in general, peer-to-peer encrypted chat apps are a particularly potent feature of the fake news landscape, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to spend more time talking about the regulatory challenges that might pose. In the UK, the Director General of the BBC, Lord Hall, has convened a group of trusted news publishers, so ourselves, the Wall Street Journal, the Hindu in India, a number of others, and plus Facebook, Google and others, to look at different ways that we could take the initiative in countering fake news. And we're building a series of concrete policy proposals, just to give you a couple of examples. Firstly, to focus specifically on elections and democracy in elections. So the US presidential election next year, the probable UK general election this year or next year, no one really knows, but also other major global elections. So we did a lot of work on the Nigerian and Indian national elections in 2019, which I believe are national elections of global significance. Another measure we're taking is to build a kind of early warning system for newsrooms so that we can detect particularly virulent pieces of fake news before they become current, and take action to kind of call them out and reject them, and how we might share technology between public broadcasters, for example, to label our own video content. I'm going to come on in a bit to show you some faked up video and deep fake video. And I think for news broadcasters, the question of how you maintain the integrity of your own video online so that other people don't mess around with it, and how you would enable AI to speed up that process on tech platforms, I think is a really pressing and interesting issue that we're looking at the moment. So we've assembled all of our learning around fake news in our fake news URL, and because I wanted to have a kind of aggregator page where we could sort of publish all the tagged BBC News content about fake news that people would find interesting. So I very much encourage you to do that. We've commissioned the original research, which I've talked a little bit about. I've talked a bit about our coverage of elections. One other area I'm particularly interested in is news for young people and children, but also younger people, tweenagers as we call them in the UK. In Britain, we have a very strong children's news programme called Newsround, which is squarely targeted at children from sort of 6 to 12, so it skews quite young. And I've been working on a project to roll out a global English news program for young people around the world called My World, and we're doing this jointly with Microsoft Education and with Angelina Jolie, interestingly, as an executive producer. a strange coalition of partners who are working together on this extraordinary program, which is going to launch early next year. But I'm just going to show you a bit of video that we've made for the program to explain to children of around the age of 13 what fake news is all about. So let's just have a look at that.
The news is never silent.
International dismay as the Amazon rainforest burns.
As we've been hearing,
It's on your TV. It's in your timeline. It affects how you feel and act. Your opinions, emotions, and understanding of the world. But sometimes what you see and hear is what others want you to know. Information is power. If they can control the information, they can control how people think. Governments, businesses, campaigners, they might try to control the truth by shaping the image they want you to see. Data and algorithms are used to personalize the information you get. That opens up possibilities, but also causes problems. Because you only see part of the picture, and you might not know about other ways of seeing the world. A journalist's job is to cut through the noise, to find out what's really happening, to challenge people with power and influence, and make sure you hear views from all sides, even if you don't agree with them.
So it's very interesting to try and work backwards. So how would you explain what a journalist does to a young person around the age of 13 in a way that it could be understood everywhere in the world? And I feel that one of the big challenges around fake news is this question of media literacy, what we might call global media literacy, a lack of education, formal education in schools about how the media works, what it does, and how a young person might distinguish between content that is real and that content is suspect or fake. Now, I know that many of you, some of you in the room may work in advertising, or you're marketeers, and particularly a warm welcome to you. If you wish to purchase advertising on the bbc.com website, please see me afterwards. Always a pleasure to see so many of you in. Let me just talk a bit about brand jeopardy, because this is something else that I'm particularly interested in. There's been a lot of comment over recent years about the jeopardy for brands where their advertising sits alongside suspect or poor quality content. It's a particular issue on YouTube, but it's also an issue on news websites where, you know, part of my job as the director of BBC World Service is to decide when we take advertising off stories. So if there's a terrorist attack or a major incident in the UK, we have to take all the advertising off the front page very quickly that we see outside the UK. Obviously you don't see advertising inside the UK. But for international audiences, we don't want people to see adverts around inappropriate content, and we have a mechanism to kind of tag and suppress advertising against difficult stories. But of course, many of you know those systems are not perfect and they're not fail-safe. We looked at a very interesting phenomenon this year, which was around fake cancer videos on YouTube. So this is like really sort of what you might call quack medicine or snake oil medicine, just nonsense medicine about alternative cures for cancer that don't work. But particularly these are not in English. And we found a lot of well-known brand advertising sitting alongside nonsense health cures videos that weren't in English. And I thought this raised a couple of really interesting issues, which is why I've mentioned it, put the link up to the page there. Because firstly, it reminds us that AI is getting quite good at working in English, but it's extremely bad at working in many languages other than English, particularly kind of difficult languages or non-Roman script languages or languages that aren't very common. So we've got a specific kind of jeopardy around detecting poor quality content in non-English languages. But also the idea that the rise of quack medicine, fake medicine online, I think is a very, very pernicious issue in the fake news world. So I'm very concerned about anti-vaccination campaigns. I think this is a real challenge to decades of progress in public health. The rise of anti-vaxxing fueled by fake news, I think, is a really important issue, and it's not political. It's not about fomenting tensions between Muslims and Christians, but it's just a really pernicious campaign where fake news is being used to manipulate people to very detrimental ends. So I just thought this was a good example for that reason. Let's just look at some of the other things we started doing regularly. There's been a lot of talk in the world of journalism about fact-checking, the rise of fact-checking, and how important it is to have credible journalists fact-checking stories which may be wrong. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of that in India, where the Indian elections, the biggest democracy on earth, took place this year. We're now started in the Indian election and are still running a fact-check service on BBC News in Hindi and other Indian languages. But of course, one of the major players in this is Russia, and you'll have seen just today this Facebook story about taking down a whole load of Facebook groups which have basically been proved to be run by Russia. I think some by Iran and another one by Russia. And so we see countering Russian-backed disinformation as a really, really important thing that we're able to do, and to call that out where we can. So I'd like just to give you a few examples of European elections, actually, where we've seen specific disinformation activity, and you may be familiar with some of these, but you probably won't have seen all of them, and hopefully this will be interesting for you. So I'm going to talk a little about the French elections from 2 years ago, and then a little bit about the European parliamentary elections from this year, so you can see how much more sophisticated things have become. So as you remember, very important political battle with the Front National in France in 2017, and the election of President Macron. So we saw a lot of sort of pretty low tech and poor quality disinformation in that election. So this is just like a fake poll. It's like a faked up picture with a poll that didn't exist. So it tags Le Figaro, but there was no such poll. So we saw a lot of that kind of activity of people sharing these types of stories. So obviously that's showing Marine Le Pen in well ahead, which she wasn't at that stage. We also saw sites which generally raised up anti-establishment politics. In this case, a kind of Trump page, also publishing false information about President Macron. In this case, so this is just like lies about President Macron on Reddit. This is an interesting example that we found. And in response to what we've seen here and hundreds of other examples, France has actually passed legislation against fake news. And I think France and Singapore, and possibly Germany, I don't know if they passed their law yet, but those three countries have really been in the vanguard of passing kind of aggressive legislation to counter fake news and disinformation. And there's just a few details on the slide about what their legislation involved. Now, as you know, all journalists feel very uncomfortable about legislation covering the publishing of news, or legislation that might conceivably touch on the publishing of news. And I think that's as true in the UK as it is here in Spain, or in France, Germany, Singapore, or other countries. So, I normally say, people often say, what does the BBC think of the French anti-fake news law? And I'm afraid my sort of get-out answer is to say that it's for every individual country to decide its own regulatory framework. The BBC doesn't really have a view on your fake news law or France's fake news law or any other. But as journalists, we all feel really strongly that legislation against fake news must be able to show that it doesn't impinge on freedom of speech and on the important work that investigative journalists do, who often have to uncover facts against quite stiff legal challenges and other means. So there's a really difficult balance to strike there, but that's a bit of what the French did in response to their fake news problem. So here we go. You shift uncomfortably in your seats at this section. I'll dig out a few slides about what's happened in Spain. So it's absolutely right to say that there was fake news activity in the Spanish elections. So we just pulled up. This particular instance was the Partido Popular, and these are fake Twitter bots. So these are just kind of data names of bot accounts that were set up to push PP kind of political content, political advertising. And those were taken down. So it's an unsophisticated operation, but something that was clocked during the Spanish elections. Here we go. Here's something different. This is again linked Facebook accounts. These are linked Twitter accounts posting far right propaganda. So just posting versions of the same message, proving that they were kind of being cross-posted and controlled by a different entity. And then you see this kind of material. You've probably seen some of this stuff, but this is like you'll have to explain to me afterwards the deep significance of some of this, because it's kind of I don't really get many of the references, but clearly pretty unpleasant and offensive political memes here that have been constructed for the purpose of influencing the election campaigns. But I think the meme content is really interesting because it shows how often it's very difficult to search and have AI look at pictures. So AI is great at doing text translation, doing text analysis, but I think if you were to try and set AI to look for that kind of image or that kind of image, I think it just goes to show how difficult it is to use AI to clock memes and graphical pictures. Let's talk a bit about WhatsApp. I've mentioned it already. So just here in Spain, as in other parts of the world, we know that WhatsApp is being used. And again, I just talked there about how difficult it is to have AI search for pictures and videos. It's impossible to use AI for that on WhatsApp, because the whole principle of WhatsApp is that it's end-to-end encrypted, and WhatsApp don't want to let your AI or my AI or anyone else's AI in to look at the messages that are being exchanged. And so the end result of that, I mean, these are pretty offensive. That's just a false news story, and that's a photoshopped picture of it's a stock photo, and the guy's drawn a chain in to make that rather offensive point. And imagine how difficult it is to detect that kind of content on WhatsApp until it's too late. So by the time anyone sees it, it's probably been viewed by possibly millions of people here in Spain. So let's widen out a bit more to talk about the European elections. So we know that our friend Greta here has been a target. So I shouldn't make light of it. It's a very difficult situation, but she has been a particular target of really sort of offensive manipulation of her own image and so on. Usually from state-backed actors trying to kind of push the climate change campaign as a kind of divisive political issue. The pictures of Macron are all real pictures actually, but they were pictures that were kind of aggregated together to make a political point in France about, Macron is always sympathetic to immigrants or non-white people, which again is sort of an untrue and malicious allegation, but it just goes to show how easy it is to manipulate pictures to make that kind of political point, and how difficult it is to then counter that, and it goes very quickly beyond the sort of classic conception of what fake news is. This was something we spotted in the Italian, it was in the European election campaign, but it was in Italy. Lots and lots of really bad stuff in Italy, partly to do with very strong presence of kind of anti-establishment political parties in Italy, but also just kind of because of Italian politics. But we saw some really unpleasant material in Italy. This is a video which purported to be taken in Italy, and the content around it said, this is a Muslim immigrant attacking a statue of a woman. Let's see if we can get that to play. And so the political implication behind that was a kind of classic anti-immigrant message about what immigrants are doing to Italian values in this case. I'll stop at that point. But the point of that was that we did some analysis on it, found out very quickly it wasn't taken in Italy. It was filmed in Algeria, I believe, and we did that because we were able to do a reverse image search. So I think some of these kind of technical digital skills around just looking at the pictures and being able to search digitally, that kind of digital detective work, very quickly worked out it wouldn't come from Italy in the first place, and to be able to analyse the the sort of group of bots and malicious accounts that had promoted this and spread it. So this is a classic example of probably state-backed disinformation in European election campaign that we were able to call out, but there were probably thousands of others that we didn't and weren't able to. So this is a very complex area. What is the responsibility of the tech platforms to do things about the content that appears on their site? And this is a really topical story, because just today we've had Facebook, the hearings on Capitol Hill about Facebook. Facebook have made more announcements about malicious groups that they've deactivated and taken down. But at the same time, Mark Zuckerberg said in this interview just at the end of last week, this really interesting thing, that they wouldn't take down political advertising that is wrong, or if you prefer, lying. So this very, very difficult issue for the tech platforms about, will they actively suppress political content, kind of mainstream political content that is demonstrably false? And I think the very clear answer that's coming back from Facebook at the moment is that on balance they won't, and that they therefore value the principle of free speech, particularly in the political space, over and above this kind of idea of them being the arbiter of what is true and what is false. And I think that just goes to show what a difficult area this is for broadcasters, as well as for tech platforms. So in the Brexit campaign, if you followed it closely, you'll remember there was a bus, and on the side of the bus it said that if Leave won, that they would spend an extra £350 million a week on the National Health Service in Britain. And the BBC was attacked at the time for even using this image in our coverage. So the Remain side said that's a lie, and you shouldn't even report it, even though that was their main campaign slogan, and it was literally written on the side of a bus. And similarly, the Remain side made a series of claims about the effects on family income in the case of a Leave vote, which subsequently turned out not to be true. And we were again attacked, the BBC was again attacked for using those figures. So I think you very quickly begin to see the very great difficulties. I feel a lot of sympathy for Facebook, to be honest, because of this. I have my own views about what they should and shouldn't do, but I do feel sympathy for them, because people looking to news publishers and tech platforms to be the arbiter of what is true and what is false. And I rather think that we still live in a world where people are going to have to consume a range of different content and be sophisticated and make up their own minds, and asking people to suppress that content for you unless it is actually illegal is going to be very, very difficult. Let's just look at some other bits of fakery which I thought you might like to see. We feel very strongly about our brand, our news brand. So BBC News is the guarantor of good quality. News brands are the market's way of telling you who's trusted and who isn't. So the fact that you would go to the BBC News website to get your news means that at some level you just trust us and our values. So this is our African daily news programme focused on Africa, runs on BBC World News and on partner stations in Africa. And then this is a fake version that was mocked up and circulated as a viral video during the Kenyan elections in 2018. It said like a fake poll. So you remember we saw the fake poll a bit earlier from the French elections. Very common meme. Same thing happened in Kenya. So this is a fake video saying that Kenyatta was in the lead. I mean, he did win in the end, but and it's faked up as a fake BBC story on the left and as a fake CNN story on the right. And these are the kind of, you wouldn't know. I mean, I can just about tell that's not real because the font's not quite right, but you really wouldn't be able to tell. It was quite a sophisticated video, and once again it's circulated everywhere on WhatsApp. Millions of people had seen it before we even knew about it, and then we had a difficult dilemma about, do we call the story out and draw more attention to it, or do we just ignore it and hope it went away? In the end, we published the story and called it out because we felt it was sufficiently a widespread issue. Let's look at another more recent one. So this is the BBC Map of Kashmir. Our coverage of Kashmir has been, I think, excellent, but has got us into quite hot water, mainly with the Indian government, who are not very keen on some of the things that we reported. And we are criticised even for our use of language. So we talk about Pakistan-administered Kashmir and Indian-administered Kashmir, but sometimes in the Indian media we're accused of talking about Indian-occupied Kashmir, which we don't use that language, but the Indian media sometimes accuse us of that. In India, on the television, it is illegal to show this map because the Indian regulator does not recognise the existence of the line of control. They think that Kashmir is all India. Some of it just happens to be occupied by Pakistan. So you very quickly see the kinds of difficulties you can get into as an international broadcaster over what maps you show, what language you use. Our coverage of Kashmir showed a number of shooting incidents where live ammunition had been used. It showed the extent and size of the demonstrations that were going on in the valley, and this got us into a lot of hot water with the Indian media, which behaves in moments of crisis in quite a nationalist way. So not just the Indian government, but also you can see this is the British. This is this question about Indian occupied Kashmir. So some jokers in the Indian media said, "Oh, well, why don't you talk about British occupied Ireland?" You know, sort of that's the kind of how they chose to stoke the row. And Shekhar Kapoor and others attacked us on Indian media as being in the pockets of the Pakistani government. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the Pakistanis were very pleased with the coverage because it suited their short-term political interests. And so, although you can see from these tweets, although we're very often accused of bias by Pakistan, in this instance, they then said, well, of course, the BBC's coverage is wonderful because it demonstrates the veracity of some political points they were making. So I think in my position, you learn to not take any short-term gain. I'm not particularly happy about this because I think it'll just be the other way around. In 6 months, we'll report on something in Pakistan that the Pakistani government don't like, and then they'll say that we're biased. So you just get used to just plow your own furrow, do your job, and really ignore as far as possible the criticisms as well as the praise from people with a kind of interest in how you're reporting stories. To finish at some of the emerging video technology that I've referred to a little earlier, so you'll all be aware of this question of deep fakes, which is a phrase we often use to talk about manipulated video. And this is a particular growing area of concern for broadcasters and all kinds of publishers. And I've just got a few examples to show you the kind of extent of how fast the technology is moving right now. So this first example, you're probably familiar with it. It's the doctored Nancy Pelosi video. So I'll just play you a quick burst of this.
Had a press conference in the Rose Garden with all this sort of visuals that obviously were planned long before. And then he had a press conference in the Rose Garden with all this sort of visuals that obviously were planned long before.
The implication of this was that she was drunk or on drugs, and it was played on mainstream US media. So I think it was originated on Fox News in that form, but it had originated online before it was broadcast on the television. And this is an absolute stone cold example. I mean, this one was quite easy to spot, and the media in the US called it out very effectively. There was a previous incident in the White House where the CNN, Jim Acosta's trying to grab the microphone from the press spokeswoman. Do you remember this story? And someone released a video that had been doctored to make it look like he hit the microphone out of her hand, whereas they altered the speed of the video and so on. So this is becoming quite a normal, this is like the new normal in American politics. And I think that is quite worrying, but I think it also poses big challenges for broadcasters and news outlets about how do you spot this stuff and how do you call it out. Let's just look at a few different examples. So this one, last year we set ourselves the challenge of making our own deep fake. And I'll tell you in a bit like how we did it and how long it took, but the video is pretty self-explanatory. The person you're going to see is Matthew Amreliwala, who I hope some of you have seen him before. He's one of our news anchors, and he presents on BBC World News.
इसलिए मैं बेताबी से देखना चाहता हूँ.
What did you think watching
That's
that?
incredible, actually, and unsettling, because I know I can't do that. 1989.
He trabajado en la BBC desde 1989.
不好意思，我英语之外什么都不会说。
मैं अपने बड़े कुंबे के साथ मिलने के लिए इंडिया जाता रहता हूँ.
Some of the look out, I shout, for he's foiled you.
我英语之外什么都不会说。父母说古吉拉特语的时候，我能听懂。
the BBC since 1989.
Soy británico de segunda generación.
但是呢，我说不来，这很不幸。
मैं अपने बड़े कुंबे के साथ मिलने के लिए इंडिया जाता रहता हूँ।
What did you think watching
That's
that?
incredible, actually, and unsettling, because I know I can't do that, and then you see they've made me look as if I can. Occasionally, you can see the bit that doesn't quite match up, but the majority you can just about get away with, I think.
So there we go. This is why we have 42 language services. So it wasn't very hard to find someone to do Spanish and Bengali and Mandarin. And so that we made that just about a year ago now as part of the Beyond Fake News season launch. And it took us a couple of weeks. I mean, it took us quite a lot of work and quite a lot of computing power, but it worked really well. The technology that enables you to do that can now sit in a smartphone and can be activated in a question of seconds. And I'm just going to show you the next example. So this is a Chinese app. This is Zhao, which you probably heard about. So we're going to see the guy. Zhao is the name of the app, not the name of the Chinese guy we're about to see. But this is him living his best life as Leo DiCaprio. So I hope you've seen this, but enjoy it anyway. So there we go. @PaperX had a really fun day that day. So the really scary thing so this is now, it's like a kind of 8-second processing time to make that stuff. And so that in a year we've gone from what we did to what Zhao does. And so the Chinese weren't very happy about this actually, and there was a lot of data harvesting issues. Do you remember that Russian app that aged people's faces? So the same thing, often these apps are built to harvest data rather than for any other purpose. So there was quite a bit of regulatory hoo-ha around Zhao. But this, the reason I put it in is that it just goes to show the speed at which the technology is advancing, and the implications for news publishers and, well, everyone actually, are immense, because it conjures a world where nobody trusts anything they see anymore. And that is a huge challenge to how people consume news online if their trust is broken in what the evidence of their own eyes. And we'll only need a few of these to sort of cut through before public trust in the news that they view online will start to be seriously eroded. I suppose my kind of action point off the back of that is, firstly, consume news on a platform that you trust. So if you want to see BBC News, please go to the BBC News website or open the BBC News app. I'm not saying don't use Apple News. Well, Apple News is fine. Apple News I'm less worried about. But I'm not saying don't use Facebook, but I'm just saying be aware that things you see on Facebook that say they come from the BBC might not be. They probably are, but they might not be. And certainly if you're on Reddit or 4chan or anything you see that says it's come from the BBC, probably isn't. So there's a really important lesson about, if you have brands that you trust, go to their direct sites, watch their channels, and if they're a commercial organisation, pay for them, please. We can discuss this in the Q&A, but the need to support the sustainable commercial model for news. So I've tried to sketch out a few ways in which the BBC has responded to this enormous challenge. And I've also sketched out some of the difficulties with the regulatory response that we've had. So what we talked a bit about, the French legislation, the German legislation, and the Singapore legislation. We can do so much, only so much, as a news broadcaster. We can generate kind of interesting content to stimulate your imagination and to cause you to question things. And we can publish a certain amount of content of that online for people to look at and to provoke thought. But in the end, it seems to me that the solutions to these problems have to come from governments, from independent regulators, and of course from news users themselves, who have a responsibility to, as I say, take care before you share. So don't share things if you think they might not be true. And you'd be surprised how many people, per our original research, do share things in the full knowledge that they're probably not true, but they'd quite like auntie or uncle or grandfather or someone to kind of give them the real version of events. So this is a really big driver of fake news sharing. So I said right at the start that the BBC's trust relationship with its audiences is the most critical thing. So we're going to share how we come to these judgments. We'll share our sources, share our analysis. We'll demonstrate how we gather the news on the ground. We'll admit when we're not sure about something. So if we can't say something's 100% true, we'll tell you that. And I think just to take reporting in China, for example, as an example of often we just aren't able to totally definitively report on events in China or North Korea, the obvious, or Iran even more. There are places on the globe we can't go. We can't get into parts of Syria. It's too dangerous. We can't get into Iran. And we try to report as accurately as we can. But sometimes we just don't know, and we'll tell you that we don't know. And crucially, the BBC is an organisation that admits when it's got something wrong. And I'm very proud of that, even though it's very uncomfortable at the time. And I think one of the ways that you can tell a trusted broadcaster from one that isn't, for example, the difference between the BBC and RT, for example, one of the many differences between the BBC and RT is that we have an open and accountable complaints procedure that anyone can access, and it often pulls us up and tells us when we've got something wrong. And I think that's really, really important. So listen, thank you. You've been an incredibly attentive audience. I hope that's covered. I kind of wanted to stimulate conversation more than anything else. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, which I will try and answer in a non-fake way. And please ask anything you would like. And if someone could turn the air conditioning back on, that'd be good, because it's got really hot up here. So thank you.
What do you think companies, big companies nowadays, like Facebook or Google, responsibility on this fake news stuff?
Well, they have a huge responsibility. I mean, clearly they do. And I think if you were giving them the benefit of the doubt, you would say they've realised in the last 18 months or so, particularly after the 2016 presidential election, that they have realised that this problem is going to kill them unless they get on top of it. That is because ultimately the strength of regulators, particularly in the European Union, but also in the United States, the kind of regulatory strength ranged against them is a potential, business killer. The guy from John from Microsoft, who was at the Club de Madrid conference, was talking very powerfully about if you're an office holder in a public company, you're really, really scared of what regulation can do to you if you don't comply with it, and that Facebook have really started to focus on what they have to do to tackle the problem. Having said that, I have to say that if you're a news publisher, this is not so much the BBC's view, because we're not primarily a commercial organisation, but if you're a commercial news publisher, your view is Facebook has destroyed my business. It's taken all my direct access to audiences, and I don't make any of the money back off advertising, and I don't see any of the audience data. So they're not perhaps very sympathetic to Facebook's new council to advise on which stories to take down. Nick Clegg wants to form this kind of advisory council for takedowns or whatever. So I can only observe what the rest of you see in the news, which is I do think they've woken up to this, but I don't think they really know clearly what the end point will be, and I don't think I do either.
I have a question related to that one, and the issue that I want to hear your opinion on the issue that the fact that Facebook and Google are American companies, and regulation would have to come from the American government, and they're, on the opposite side, you have the Russian government with the Internet Agency. So what do you think needs to happen? Because, as you said, governments and regulations are key, but there's an information war almost. And probably regulation from the US is going to be influenced by Russia's involvement in the elections, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really, a lot of the tech platforms are really worried about the 2020 presidential election, and they're determined not to make the mistakes they made in 2016, and they are working very hard to try and get ahead of the bot army who are trying to disrupt the 2020 presidential elections. And that's not just in InfoSec around the integrity of voting machines, but it's to do with fake news and manipulation of the political campaign. I think I think regulators actually in all territories can cause quite a lot of damage to Facebook and other companies. I agree that the US regulatory framework is the one that hurts them the most. And I also agree that one of the frustrations of trying to regulate these massive tech platforms is they tend to be registered, domiciled, tax domiciled, operationally domiciled in a multitude of different countries, some of which are totally outside the regulatory framework. But if you think, some of the tech platforms have very significant operations in Ireland, of course, which because of the tax regime in the Republic of Ireland, which is obviously part of the EU. And so there's quite a lot that European regulators can do, I think. And I think the European Parliament and European regulators have woken up to this, as have the tech platforms. So I think this is one of the big coming battles for the next 4 or 5 years. It's like, what regulation gets through and what does it cost those businesses, and are they still viable at the end of it? I mean, they have an awful lot of cash to sit on, so you'd think they probably would be, but it's one of those confirmation biases where you can only imagine the world as it is now. It's impossible to imagine the world without Google and Facebook and YouTube, but actually reality tells us that in 10 years maybe at least one of those companies won't be here anymore, and it's very hard to see how that would happen, but probably will happen. We just can't see how.
So you are very lucky because you work for BBC, and
doesn't always feel
you
like
don't
that.
Rely. No. Here comes the bad part. So you don't rely on advertising, but there are many companies that rely on advertising, and for them it's extremely important to be fast and to be quick. So you were talking about fact checking before. What can these companies do about that? Because they are really in a very weak position.
Well, thanks for following up on that. I mean, I should say we do have quite a significant commercial news operation. So BBC World News and the website in English, bbc.com, are wholly funded by a commercial subsidiary which sells advertising and takes pay TV revenues for BBC World News. And it's a $100 million a year business for us. Difficult business, but a biggish business. So we do sell a lot of advertising, and that's one of the reasons I'm really interested in this, because I have to comply a lot of our advertising. I have to deal with the advertising takedowns. It's something I'm really into. I think that the response about 2.5 years ago, when this issue first came up about brand jeopardy, the reaction of lots of the brand advertisers was just to kind of blacklist the entire news category. So just to remove all their advertising from the totality of all news sites, irrespective of who they were. And partly that's, the mechanics of programmatic advertising make that quite easy. You just check the white box list and say, I don't want any of my ads served against news content. That has been an unbelievably bad, destructive outcome for quality news providers. And I think my sort of really strong message to marketeers and chief marketing officers and others in this industry is, do not abandon quality news organizations who need your advertising spend, bluntly, because we just end up in a vicious circle of good quality journalism being unable to make a commercial return. So it's really important that marketeers adopt a sensitive response to these challenges, and that they recognize the unique value of advertising around news, which is you have highly engaged audiences, long dwell time, high brand loyalty, broadly a kind of affluent demographic audience that you would want to reach, and take sensible decisions around supporting whatever paper you want to support in your national market, or advertising on the BBC, or advertising on CNN. I mean, I'm not making a narrow competitive point here. I'm making a point about our industry, which is that advertisers, marketers, and the advertising industry and the big blue chip advertising firms need to continue to support quality news output. Otherwise, we're in a load more trouble than we are already. That's my simple message.
I'm sorry to address the elephant in the room, but I'm going to ask a question about Brexit.
Oh, okay. If we managed to get through 40 minutes without that.
But I wonder if you really think it's commonly, people commonly say that fake news were an element, for the Leave campaign to win the referendum. Do you think that fake news will play that much big of a role?
So my personal view is no. I'm just speaking as an individual here rather than on behalf of the BBC. there certainly was illegitimate activity in all areas of the referendum, and some of that has come out publicly and been published upon, and obviously there were some irregularities around some parts of the Leave campaign. But my personal view is I don't think that's why Leave won. I think the Leave campaign won because in the end there were more people in Britain prepared to go to a ballot box and vote to leave the EU, and that was because it's difficult to explain unless you lived in the UK, but there's a very, very strong depth of feeling amongst the voters about Britain's relationship with the EU, and I think more of those voters turned out than the Remain voters. And that, I'm making a simplistic point, but I think that is generally my view. There were certainly issues in the campaign to do with fake news, political advertising, abuses of the electoral system, particularly the electoral finance system. Clearly there were issues around that, but my personal view is that they weren't the decisive factor. The decisive factor was that Britain's membership of the EU has been highly controversial in Britain for many, many years, and nobody ever gave the population the chance to vote on it in a 50-50 referendum before, and this is what happened.
I have a couple of questions for you in a comment. First of all, fake news, for myself, is an umbrella term for many things, for lies, hoaxes, disinformation, memes, and rhetoric, just rhetoric. I think there are different things and need different approach, don't you think? This is my first question. The second question is regarding, so let's remember the origin of the term fake news, which is news. So it's about the press and was coined by Trump. So there's a kind of a provocation here. So the responsibility of the press in shaping the word, don't you think that many prestigious outlets, press outlets, disseminate half-truths or 100% fake news? You take the British press, for example. I can see fake news, and I was living, my family still in London. I can see fake news both on left-wing publications like The Guardian or right-wing publications like The Sun. So we're talking about fake news, and perhaps we are just creating anonymous enemies, and someone in a computer disseminate fake Twitter accounts. But a large responsibility, in my opinion, it's about the press. And I'd like to understand your opinion about this.
Thank you. It is a provocation, but it's a very good and fair one. So you're right, the term is all but useless in many ways because it's become a label for politicians to attack coverage or institutions that they don't like. So obviously Donald Trump and the New York Times, or Donald Trump and CNN. So yes, I accept all of the limitations of using the term, but there is clearly something happening here, isn't there? There is a difference between the ink press, hot metal press, and the world of newspapers, where newspapers have always published stuff that's inaccurate, sensational. That's been true for as long as there's been newspapers, but that doesn't mean that newspapers haven't had a really beneficial effect on the development of democracies, the emergence of middle class, the support for strengthened democracy. It's not perfect, but it's kind of worked in many countries. But we're in a different paradigm now. Newspapers are no longer the dominant force that they were, either commercially or in terms of opinion, and the digital consumption of news has completely changed the game. And I think the thing I'm most worried about is how hard it is to discriminate between good quality and poor quality news online, particularly when you're consuming it on a third-party site. So ideally on Facebook, but more worryingly when you're consuming it on some crazy aggregator that you don't even know what the values of the aggregator are. So I think you make a reasonable point, which was like, it wasn't perfect before. You're absolutely right about that. But is it a lot worse now? Clearly it is, and that is because of the digital revolution in news and news publishing. There are some really good things about digital news. It's possible for people to reach out and find a community around kind of really niche interests they have. If you want lots of news about commercial shipping or something, the digital news finds a really good way for the market to put a value on that, for people to pay for it and to support organizations that do it. The problem is if you believe that vaccination is a CIA conspiracy or that the world is flat, again, the digital world provides you with a really quick way to connect with like-minded loonies and to kind of create a kind of pretend news environment where you will feed each other stories that support your pre-existing set of prejudices. So you're right to be critical of newspapers down the years, but it doesn't change the nature of the challenge that we face, I think. Could I ask, would a woman like to ask a question? Because I have a particular bugbear about this, so thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting and well, I learned a lot actually. And you mentioned one thing that caught my attention. You said we're going to be having fake news for the next 10, 20 years. So I guess that there is a hope, or you know that somebody's going to finish, or we're going to finish with fake news. And I would like to know how you think this is going to happen in 10 or 20 years, or why do you have this, you know, you made this comment that this will end one day or another.
So I can't see any end to the phenomenon completely. I can't see an end to the fact that even in 20 years we will have imperfect news economies in developing countries, countries that don't have strong regulators, that are in chaos for other reasons. I think there's always going to be a fake news problem. But the issue is, can the industry reform itself, and can the structures of our news change quickly enough to mean that overall we're winning the battle more than we're losing the battle? I think currently we're probably just about losing, and we need to shift to winning. And that requires, again, what was discussed in Club de Madrid has been what needs to happen in regulatory and policy terms to make that change. So lots of people talked about the response to climate change, which is it took 10 or 15 years for the countries of the world to align together around an agreed set of facts around climate change and a policy-making process that was broadly led to kind of multilateral action on climate change. Feels to me it's not trivializing climate change to say these are similar issues. These are issues that require states around the world to kind of align their regulatory and news publishing frameworks, and that will take many years, and then when we've done that we'll really start to see an improvement. But as I mentioned earlier in the talk, you know, how do you educate, you know, there's 1.2 billion people in India. How do you educate successive generations of Indian school children to understand that what they see on WhatsApp may well be nonsense? That is something that only a government can really deliver. It can't really be delivered by a news broadcaster or by a philanthropist, although all those kinds of organisations can help. But really, national governments have got to engage on this, and they've got to engage with each other before we'll make the change, I think.
But just continuing with this rationale, do you think that governments have a strong enough motivation? Because if we look at Trump or the examples that were just brought up, maybe fake news is good.
Well, I would say there are short-term temptations around manipulating fake news. If you're a sort of strongman government in the Middle East or in any other part of the world, or you know, if you're Modi, you know, the BJP very keen to attack people around fake news, and they're active in doing so, and we know that from our own research. BJP aligned activists. There's a short-term benefit because it's easy to make a political win off the back of kind of using fake news or calling people fake news. But the long-term consequences of that are really toxic for countries. You can see that in the United States. You can see it building in India and other South Asian countries. And I think you have to believe, if you're an optimist, that over time voters and governments will come to see that the long-term destructive impact of using and manipulating fake news is damaging their national security, their well-being, their livelihoods in a way that outweighs the short-term political benefits. And I am an optimist, and I think that we will win the argument that way, but it'll probably go wrong before it goes right in a number of countries. Great, if I've talked you all into submission. Go on, one more. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for this brilliant presentation, James.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask you for a specific question. Is that I see that regarding the digital platforms like Twitter or Facebook, there are some hot topics like how they manage the data, how they control the fake news. But there's another one important for me, that is the criteria to position the different information, which is about the algorithms. My question is that if you think that the digital platforms should show more transparency about their algorithms, and the problem for me here is that that's the algorithms is like the core business of that companies. So it's like sharing the recipe of the Coca-Cola.
It's the secret sauce.
That's the controversy.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And let's be honest, kind of, search engine optimization is like gaming algorithms. That's what SEO is. And it's an industry now, all in its own right. And you guys do it, and we all do it. Whenever you publish a story that says, 5 things about Meghan Markle, who is Meghan Markle? That's kind of gaming the algorithm, right? I agree with you. I agree that the algorithm is the most potent weapon that the tech platforms have to actually suppress fake news and poor quality content. So if you take the analogy of, a man standing on a street corner shouting the world is flat can only reach, a couple of dozen people an hour. But a person publishing articles, pretending to be news articles, saying that vaccination is a CIA conspiracy theory can reach millions of people. And the algorithm is what enables platforms to make sure that hardly anyone sees that content. So a man or woman writing that article can post it onto Facebook, and if their AI works well, Facebook can ensure that anti-vax content does not pop up in loads of people's news feeds, broadly. That is the way that it works. And that is a very potent weapon, and that's one of the things that makes me optimistic over time, that we will find a way to, without infringing people's freedom of speech. If someone wants to write an article saying that the world is flat, I don't think they should be legally prohibited from doing so, but it must be within our skills to prevent that from reaching, thousands of young people. And you must find this all the time. You meet people, smart young people, who really ought to know better, who say, I really think that 9/11 was an inside job, or I think George Soros is at the head of a global conspiracy. You're just like, what? Like, people, really smart young people who and you're like, how are you reading this stuff? And that is a battle that we can win, but we need platforms and news publishers to align to win it, and it's going to be very difficult. But I'm still optimistic. I have to be.
I'm conscious of the time. I have one final question, but I'd like to give the opportunity to the floor if anyone else has a question. Okay, so final one. Because it's an interesting question that Alex posed, and I think, as you mentioned before, this is a very complex, subtle, and layered problem. And you spoke about the BBC News about regulation and about not hindering freedom of speech, but I think it's very interesting. We're talking about regulation, about platforms being regulated, and should they or shouldn't they be responsible for the content and the campaigns, political campaigns, etc. But we're seeing more and more that some of these platforms are actually deplatforming certain people because they claim and they have a definition of hate speech, but they are the ones who define what is and what isn't hate speech. So I think it's very, I think it's very muddy waters when they say when we don't have to check the content of a political campaign, but we can deplatform certain people. So in my view, they're acting as a sort of a public commodity in some senses, and as a private company in others. So I just wanted to have your opinion on that and what can be done from a public sort of opinion perspective.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, you're right that tech platforms for ages have tried to maintain that they're not content publishers, and they are adamant that they are not. publishers, just like Uber wants you to believe that they're just an app for connecting riders and drivers. You know, it's like, of course they are. I mean, I can see that regulatory, you know, they don't want to have the regulatory burden of being treated as content publishers. And you know, you mentioned hate speech, and it's really interesting that that's what this Facebook, you know, the Nick Clegg Facebook Council of Elders is specifically being got together to take these incredibly difficult decisions about what is hate speech and what isn't. And the idea that you might have to take that decision about Hausa language content relating to northern Nigeria, someone in Facebook has got to say, is this Hausa language post hate speech or not? And when I said earlier that I felt some sympathy for Facebook, I think that's the kind of thing I was thinking of. I think that you need the wisdom of Solomon to make these judgments, and in the end, they are always judgments. You know, each country must have its own legal framework around hate speech, which is genuinely illegal, and that's that's a kind of easy thing that everyone can. If it's illegal, then we've got to take it down. But the as your question suggests, the huge grey area is around content that is offensive but not illegal, and whether taking it down or deprioritising it amounts to an infringement of freedom of speech. Just like I wouldn't want the police, if there was a woman on the street corner talking about Catalan independence, I don't want the Spanish police to go and arrest her. But I think that you have to accept that these are really, really difficult decisions, and those tech platforms are not set up to take those decisions. So I can think, sorry, it's not much of an answer to your question, but I think it shows exactly how we've got into the position that we're at now.
Well, thank you,
all.
Jamie.
Yeah, well, thank you all for having me. It's been very nice. I'm very apologetic. I don't speak Spanish. I should say I speak two languages other than English. I speak French and German, okay, pretty well. But we have 42 language services and only one language. So we have a French for Africa service. So I can talk to BBC Afrique in French about their content, and we don't have a German service anymore, so that's totally redundant. And I'm afraid I barely know a word of Spanish, so thank you for listening to me in English. I do apologise for not speaking Spanish, but it's been lovely to see you all, and thank you for listening so patiently, and I'm very happy to hang around. We're going to have a quick drink, and I'm very happy to hang around and talk to any of you privately if you have further questions. So thank you so much for your time. Lovely to see you all. Thank you.